London, 1845, when the fog clung to the cobblestones like forgotten prayers, and the Duke of Ashbourne's mansion stood like a cold crown above the sleeping city. The estate rose from the edge of Mayfair in blackened stone and iron elegance, its tall windows reflecting gaslight like distant judgment. Carriages came and went beneath its arched gates, but none carried warmth inside, only reputation, wealth, and the quiet rot of privilege. Inside, the House of Ashbourne had learned something it was never meant to know. Silence. Not the peaceful kind that follows contentment, but the heavy kind that settles after being ignored for too long. And at the center of that silence stood Lady Eleanor Ashbourne. She moved through the grand corridors like a memory, trying not to disturb the present. Her gowns were always refined, ivory silk in the morning, muted dove gray in the afternoon, deep navy for evening dinners she rarely spoke at. Every fabric was chosen to flatter dignity, not desire. Her corsets were tightened each dawn by a maid who no longer asked if she was comfortable, only if she could breathe enough to meet expectation. Her hair, the color of soft chestnut, was arranged in the strict Victorian fashion of the time, braided and pinned into a low, controlled coil at the nape of her neck. Not a strand was allowed to fall without permission. Even beauty in this house had rules. And yet, she was still beautiful in a way society could not quite ignore. But beauty in the Ashbourne estate had become something dangerous. Because it belonged to a woman the Duke no longer looked at. The Duke of Ashbourne was a man carved from admiration. In public, he was perfection itself, tall, composed, always dressed in dark tailored coats that framed his authority like armor. His gloves were always immaculate. His silver cufflinks caught candlelight like quiet thunder. His hair, styled in the sharp aristocratic sweep of the era, never dared fall out of place, as if even disorder feared him. He spoke in Parliament with controlled precision. He smiled at gatherings with practiced charm. Society called him a man of vision, discipline, and restraint. They did not know restraint was something he only practiced outside his own home. Because inside Ashbourne House, restraint did not exist. Only entitlement did. The first time Lady Eleanor realized her marriage had begun to rot was not in anger, but in stillness. It was a winter evening when she heard laughter echoing from the upper corridor. Not the laughter of servants, not guests, women. She had walked toward it slowly, her footsteps softened by thick Persian carpets imported from a time when this house still believed in dignity. The candles along the walls flickered as if afraid to witness what was coming. And then she saw it. Her own chamber door slightly open, warm light spilling out, music faintly playing from a violin below. And inside, her husband's voice. Not alone. She did not enter immediately. Instead, she stood there, half shadowed by the corridor, as if waiting for the moment to feel real. Then she saw the woman. A visitor from London's opera circles, draped in crimson silk, her dark hair pinned high in elaborate curls adorned with pearls. She laughed softly as she sat on the edge of Eleanor's dressing table, touching things that were not hers, as though ownership was irrelevant in this house. The Duke stood behind her, close, too close. And then he did something that would have once shattered worlds. He led her toward the bed, Eleanor's bed. The chamber itself was grand, mahogany furniture carved with intricate Victorian detailing, velvet drapes heavy as secrets, and a four-poster bed that dominated the room like a throne built for intimacy and betrayal alike. And there, under that same roof of silk and memory, the Duke lay down beside another woman, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though nothing had ever belonged to anyone else. Eleanor did not move. Her hand tightened slightly against the doorframe, not in rage, but in something more fragile. Understanding. This was not an accident, not a moment of weakness. This was routine. The Duke finally noticed her presence. He turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging a servant entering at the wrong hour. His expression did not change. "Do not wait up," he said calmly, his voice carrying the same tone he used in Parliament when dismissing matters beneath concern. Then he returned to the woman beside him, as if Eleanor had already left the room. Perhaps, in his mind, she had. Eleanor stepped back, quietly, The door did not slam. It did not creak. It closed like a thought being buried. And in that moment, something inside her stopped resisting. Not love, not loyalty, but expectation. The expectation that she was still part of this marriage. She walked the corridor alone. The house felt different now, not louder, but emptier. As if every portrait of Ashbourne ancestors hanging on the walls had turned their painted eyes away from her. Servants bowed as she passed, but none dared speak. They had learned her role too well. The Duchess who did not complain. The wife who did not break. The woman who endured. But endurance has a shape. And that night, something inside it began to crack. In the library, she paused. Tall shelves stretched like silent witnesses, filled with law books, estate ledgers, and documents the Duke rarely touched unless they increased his wealth or reputation. She approached slowly. Her fingers brushed the leather bindings. For the first time, she did not see decoration. She saw structure, ownership, power written in ink instead of blood. And she understood something simple and dangerous. She was not powerless. She was simply unexamined. When she returned to her chamber later that night, it was no longer a place of rest. It was a place she had been replaced inside. She stood near the window, watching London's fog roll through the gaslit streets below. Carriages moved like ghosts. Men in top hats passed under flickering lamps. Life continued beyond these walls, with no knowledge of her stillness. Behind her, the bed remained untouched from earlier. Occupied memory still lingered in its shape. And yet, for the first time, she did not look at it as something she had lost. She looked at it as something she could leave. That night, Lady Eleanor did not sleep. She sat instead at her writing desk, hands folded neatly, posture still perfect even in solitude. The candle burned low beside her, casting soft gold across her composed face. Outside, the house of Ashbourne remained awake in its own way, breathing through secrets, indulging in indulgences, unaware that something within its walls had begun to shift. Not loudly, not violently, but permanently, because silence, once learned by a house, does not stay obedient forever. Sometimes it begins to think, and that night it began to think of leaving. The winter wind moved through London like a restless confession that refused to be buried. Inside Ashbourne House, the firelight burned gold, but it did not warm anything it touched. It only made the shadows look more expensive. That evening, the Duke returned later than usual. He entered as he always did, without urgency, without apology. His greatcoat, dark wool trimmed with velvet, hung perfectly over his shoulders. His gloves were still on, though slightly loosened at the wrist from the night's indulgence. A faint scent of cigar smoke clung to him, mixed with the perfume of someone else's laughter still lingering in his memory. Behind him walked a woman, not a servant, not a guest of formal invitation, a presence. She wore deep crimson silk, the fabric catching every flicker of candlelight like spilled wine. Her hair was styled in elaborate Victorian curls pinned high with jewel combs, carefully arranged to suggest elegance without innocence. She moved as though the house belonged to her already, as though she had been invited long before permission was ever required. And perhaps in this house she had been. Eleanor saw them before they saw her. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, one hand resting lightly on the carved banister. Her posture was perfect, as always, composed, unshaken, a portrait still learning how to breathe. Her gown that evening was ivory, simple, high-necked, modest in the way noble women were expected to appear when they were no longer the center of attention. Her hair was pinned back in a soft Victorian coil, though a few strands had loosened near her temple, as if even order had begun to abandon her. She did not move. She did not descend. She simply watched. The Duke paused only briefly when he saw her. A glance. Nothing more. As if she were part of the architecture. Then his attention returned to the woman beside him. "Come," he said calmly, offering his arm. The woman took it without hesitation. And together, they walked deeper into the house that once belonged to vows. Eleanor followed at a distance, not because she was curious, but because she already knew. The corridor stretched long beneath chandeliers that cast fractured light across polished marble floors. Portraits of Ashbourne ancestors lined the walls, stern faces frozen in judgment, watching history repeat itself without intervention. The Duke did not notice her steps behind him, or perhaps he had stopped expecting them to matter. They entered her chamber, Eleanor's chamber. The door opened, and the room revealed itself like a memory forced to relive betrayal. The four-poster bed stood at its center, massive, carved from dark mahogany imported from colonial trade routes, its velvet drapes drawn back like stage curtains awaiting performance. The sheets were freshly changed that morning by the maid under Eleanor's instruction. White linen, crisp, controlled. It had been a space of marriage once. Now it waited like evidence. The Duke loosened his cravat as he stepped inside, as if returning to something familiar rather than forbidden. The woman in crimson smiled softly, looking around the room with slow appreciation. "How lovely," she murmured. Not admiration, ownership. Eleanor remained at the doorway, still, quiet, her hands folded neatly in front of her, fingers unmoving. Her face did not betray shock, nor anger, nor collapse. But something in her gaze had changed, not widened, not softened, sharpened, as though she was no longer seeing a scene, but recording a truth. The Duke turned slightly, noticing her presence again. For the first time that evening, his expression shifted. Not guilt, not hesitation. Annoyance, as if she had interrupted something scheduled. "You are still awake," he said simply. It was not a question. It was a dismissal disguised as observation. Eleanor did not answer. Silence had become her language here. But tonight it was no longer obedience. It was clarity. The Duke walked toward the bed and placed his gloves on the nearby chair. Careless, practiced, unbothered. The crimson-dressed woman followed him, her laughter softer now, almost ceremonial, as if she understood the role she was stepping into. She sat on the edge of the bed first, testing it, claiming it. The mattress dipped slightly beneath her weight. A small sound, a quiet theft. Eleanor's gaze dropped to that movement, the smallest shift of fabric against fabric. And something inside her, long restrained, long rationalized, did not break. It settled, like ice forming across deep water. The Duke finally looked at her properly, still standing in the doorway, still not reacting. "Do not wait up," he said again, more impatient this time, as though repetition might eventually turn cruelty into routine politeness. Then he turned away, as if that sentence had completed his responsibility toward her for the evening. Eleanor's voice did not rise. It did not tremble. It did not arrive at all, because there was nothing left in her that believed speaking would change anything. Instead, she stepped back, one pace, then another, not retreating in defeat, but withdrawing as one leaves a room they no longer recognize as theirs. The door remained open behind her. She did not close it. Later that night, the house settled into its usual rhythm. Candles dimmed, footsteps faded, doors locked in polite sequence. But in Eleanor's chamber, something unnatural continued. Laughter, soft conversation, the rustle of silk against silk sheets that did not belong to either of them. And beneath it all, the stillness of a room that had stopped resisting being used. Eleanor walked alone through the corridor, barefoot, not out of rebellion, out of absence. The marble beneath her feet was cold, but she did not feel it. The house around her felt distant, as though she had stepped slightly outside of it while still standing inside it. She passed the grand portraits again. This time, she noticed something she had never allowed herself to see before. None of them looked at her. Not one. They looked past her, as if she had always been temporary. She reached the library. The doors were heavy oak, carved with Ashbourne insignia, lions, crowns, ancestral pride frozen into wood. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old decisions. She moved between the shelves slowly, her fingers trailing across spines of law, inheritance, contracts, estate ledgers, things the Duke signed without reading. Things she had once been told were not her concern. She pulled one ledger free, opened it, read, and then another, and another. Each page revealed something small. Each small thing became larger when connected. Debts hidden behind investments. Properties quietly mortgaged. Legal clauses granting her access she had never been told she possessed. A marriage settlement drafted in her favor long before she ever became a wife. For the first time that night, Eleanor exhaled. Not in relief, not in despair, but in recognition. The house had not only taken from her, it had overlooked her, and in that oversight it had left openings. When she finally returned to her chamber hours later, the corridor was silent again. The Duke's laughter no longer echoed. The woman's presence had dissolved into the architecture. The bed, however, remained disturbed, not ruined, not destroyed, just no longer neutral. Eleanor stood at the threshold of her own room. She did not enter immediately. She studied it the way one studies a place they may never need to belong to again. The curtains, the chair, the bed, everything still in place, and yet nothing intact. Then she turned away, not toward anger, not toward confrontation, but toward understanding what comes after endurance ends. Because somewhere deep inside Ashbourne House, silence had begun to change its shape, and for the first time since her marriage began. Lady Eleanor did not ask how to survive it. She began to wonder how to leave it behind. London, 1845, when winter evenings arrived early, and candlelight became the city's only fragile promise against the dark. That night, Ashbourne House prepared for celebration. But Lady Eleanor prepared for departure. The grand ball was announced a week prior, as all Ashbourne affairs were, without question, without invitation for refusal. The Duke had insisted upon it. A display of standing, he called it in Parliament's tone. The house must be seen as thriving. And so it was made so. Chandeliers were polished until they burned like captured suns. Musicians arrived in black coats and powdered confidence. Tables groaned beneath silver platters and imported wines. The grand ballroom was transformed into a vision of aristocratic excess. Velvet drapes, gilded mirrors, and polished marble floors that reflected every carefully curated lie. Ladies arrived in sweeping gowns of sapphire, emerald, and rose silk, their hair arranged in elaborate Victorian curls adorned with pearls and jeweled pins. Gentlemen stood in tailored coats of midnight wool, their waistcoats embroidered with quiet arrogance. And at the center of it all, like a crown worn without emotion, stood the Duke of Ashbourne, flawless, controlled, admired, and entirely unaware that his house was about to lose its light. Eleanor stood beside him for the required introductions. Her gown that evening was deep ivory silk, layered with subtle lace at the sleeves, modest yet impossibly refined. Her hair was pinned in a restrained Victorian style, though softer now. Less armor, more farewell. A single pearl rested at her throat, catching candlelight like a quiet heartbeat. She smiled when spoken to. She curtsied when expected. She existed exactly as society required. But inside her, something had already stepped beyond the room. The Duke did not notice the difference. He never had. To him, Eleanor was consistency, a presence that did not interrupt, a silence that confirmed order. He spoke to guests about expansion, trade, influence, his voice smooth, practiced, untouched by doubt. And yet, as he stood beneath the chandeliers, something imperceptible shifted in the air around the house. Not noise, not movement, absence. It began in the West Wing, one candle at a time. Servants moved through corridors as instructed, quietly extinguishing flames, not out of neglect, but obedience to a new, unseen direction. Hallways dimmed first, then staircases, then drawing rooms that had once burned with warm expectation. The house did not protest. It obeyed. Eleanor had not raised her voice. She had not issued commands in anger. She had simply done what the Duke never expected her to do. She had begun to act, quietly, precisely, through ledgers, through estate authority quietly embedded in marriage settlements, through permissions signed years ago and never read closely enough to be understood. And the house, so long under illusion of his control, had finally discovered another owner of its mechanisms. As music swelled in the ballroom, Eleanor stepped away. No one noticed at first. That was the beauty of aristocratic attention. It only focused where it expected significance. She moved through the corridor adjacent to the hall, where the laughter of guests softened into distant echo. Her footsteps were silent against polished wood. Her gown flowed behind her like a fading decision. She passed portraits again. This time, she did not feel watched. She felt released. In the servants' corridor, maids bowed as she passed. Not out of fear, out of understanding. They had seen the change before anyone else. A mistress who no longer corrected small errors. A woman who no longer asked permission for stillness. A presence that had begun to gather itself away from the house instead of into it. One maid hesitated. "Shall we stop, my lady?" she whispered. Eleanor paused. For a moment, the entire house seemed to wait for her answer. Then she spoke softly. "Continue." And just like that, another candle died in the West Wing. The Duke, meanwhile, remained in the ballroom, unaware. He raised a glass in conversation, laughing at a remark from a visiting lord. The chandeliers above him glittered brilliantly, reflecting in polished crystal and aristocratic confidence. No one noticed that the farthest corners of the house had begun to darken. Not all at once, but steadily, like breath leaving a sleeping body. Eleanor returned briefly to her chamber, not to hesitate, but to finalize. Inside, everything remained as it had been arranged that morning, perfectly composed, perfectly still. The bed, once a site of humiliation, now looked like something irrelevant rather than painful. She approached the writing desk, Saturday, and wrote. No ink blotches, no hesitation, only clarity. A letter addressed not to anger, but to truth. To the Duke of Ashbourne, to the house that mistook endurance for consent, to a life she no longer inhabited. She folded it once, left it precisely where it would be seen, and then stood. Outside her chamber, the corridor lights dimmed further. Another servant passed, lowering a candle in its brass holder. The flame trembled, then vanished. At the end of the eastern corridor waited the carriage passage. The doors were already open. Not forced, prepared. A carriage stood outside, dark and modest, its horses quiet in the cold London air. No crest adorned it, no announcement followed it. It did not belong to spectacle. It belonged to departure. Eleanor stepped into the corridor leading to it. For the first time, the house behind her felt like it was holding its breath, not to trap her, but to witness her leaving. Above her, the ballroom continued its illusion. Music, laughter, glasses clinking in practiced harmony. And then, a slight murmur, a pause in conversation, a flicker in one of the far chandeliers. A guest noticed a shadow where light should have been. Then another, and another. Like a ripple no one had agreed to acknowledge. The Duke turned slightly mid-conversation. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not loud, just missing. He scanned the room. The candles still burned. The guests still smiled. The music still played. And yet, the house no longer felt entirely his. Eleanor reached the carriage. The driver opened the door without speaking. She paused only once, not to look back, but to acknowledge the weight of what she was leaving behind. Ashbourne House rose behind her, grand, lit, alive with ignorance. A palace still believing in its own permanence. Inside the ballroom, another candle went out. Then another. Then three at once in the far corridor. Whispers began, not of panic, but confusion. Servants exchanged glances. Guests shifted uneasily. The Duke finally stepped away from the crowd, his smile fading for the first time that night. By the time he reached the main hall, half the house had dimmed. Not in ruin, but in retreat. And in the silence between extinguished flames and untouched arrogance, he saw it. A letter on the desk, waiting, unmoving, complete. Outside, Eleanor's carriage began to move, slowly, steadily, away from the glow of Ashbourne House. Not as escape, but as conclusion. And as the wheels turned through the fog of London, the House of Ashbourne learned something it had never been taught. Silence does not always mean endurance. Sometimes, it means leaving before the final candle goes out. The Duke returned to it alone. The grand ball had collapsed into confusion behind him. Music cut mid-note, guests departing in uneasy murmurs, servants whispering in corners where certainty used to live. And through it all, one thing remained unchanged: the letter, waiting on his desk like a verdict that required no witness. He entered the study with measured steps, still dressed in his formal evening coat, though the elegance now felt misplaced, like armor worn after the war had already ended. The room was dim, not entirely dark, but stripped of its earlier confidence. A single candle burned low near the writing desk, its flame bending slightly in the draught, as though even fire here had begun to hesitate. The Duke did not speak. For once, the house did not answer him with ease. He reached the desk slowly. The letter was placed with deliberate precision. Not thrown, not hidden, not left in anger. Placed. That detail unsettled him more than any accusation ever could. He broke the seal and began to read. The first lines did not accuse him. That was what made them unbearable. There was no trembling ink, no emotional collapse preserved on paper, no dramatic pleading for change. Only clarity. Eleanor wrote as someone documenting a life already concluded. She described the house, not as a home, but as an institution that had mistaken her endurance for permission. She did not mention each betrayal in detail. She did not need to. She simply stated what had become true. She had been present. She had been patient. She had been reduced to observation. And now she was no longer available for it. The Duke read without moving. Once. Then again, as if repetition might return control to the words. But the letter did not change. It remained what it was. Final, without being cruel. Honest, without asking permission. Only when he reached the middle did something unfamiliar surface in him. Not anger, not pride, recognition. Because the letter did not describe a woman destroyed by him. It described a woman who had been watching him fail to see her. He lowered the papers slightly. The study felt different now. The shelves of law books seemed heavier. The fireplace colder. The room that once reflected his authority now felt like it had been quietly emptied of belief. His gaze shifted across the desk. Her absence was not loud. It was architectural, as though a supporting beam had been removed, and the structure had simply learned not to collapse. Outside the study, the house remained half-lit. Servants moved carefully, uncertain whether the evening still belonged to order or aftermath. Some candles had been relit. Others were left dark out of instinct more than instruction. Ashbourne House had become unsure of its own rules. And for the first time in years, so had the Duke. He walked through the corridor, slowly, not with purpose, but with the unsettling awareness that purpose no longer guaranteed direction. He passed the ballroom first. Empty now. Chairs slightly displaced. Glasses half finished. The echo of music still clinging to the walls like a memory that did not know it had ended. Then the staircase. Then the upper hall. Then her chamber. The door was open. He had no memory of leaving it that way. Inside, everything remained exactly as it had been the night before departure. The bed was made. Perfectly. Too perfectly. As if no human emotion had ever disturbed it. The curtains were drawn. The air still carried the faint scent of lavender and linen soap. Even the dressing table was arranged with habitual precision. But it was empty in a way that had nothing to do with objects. It was empty of expectation. He stepped inside. For the first time, he did not assume the room belonged to him. That realization arrived too late to undo anything. His eyes fell to the bed, and suddenly memory returned. Not as indulgence, but as consequence. The nights he dismissed. The presence he treated as background. The silence he mistaken for acceptance. All of it reorganized itself into understanding. She had not been silent because she lacked voice. She had been silent because she had been deciding. He reached the edge of the bed, but did not sit. Instead, he stood there as though waiting for the room to correct him. It did not. Downstairs, another candle went out, not extinguished by hand, but by neglect. Then another in the west corridor. The house was no longer maintaining itself the way it used to. and no one knew whether to be afraid of that or relieved. Days passed, then weeks. Ashbourne House did not recover, it recalibrated. The Duke canceled gatherings, then reduced staff requests, then stopped attending Parliament for a short time under the excuse of estate matters. But in truth, he remained inside, because leaving felt like admitting the house no longer needed him to define it. And Eleanor, she was not lost. She had simply arrived somewhere else. In the countryside estate of her birth family, winter light fell differently, softer, less performative. The air smelled of soil instead of coal smoke, of space instead of expectation. She walked through gardens that had begun to grow without instruction. Her hair was no longer pinned into restraint. It fell loosely now, tied back only when practicality required it. Her gowns shifted with time, still refined, but no longer shaped for approval. She no longer moved like someone being observed. She moved like someone deciding. One afternoon, a carriage arrived at the estate gate. She did not rush. She already knew. When she stepped outside, she found the Duke standing there. Not dressed for Parliament, not dressed for society, just present, worn in a way Ashbourne House had never allowed him to be. He did not speak immediately, nor did she. The silence between them was not the same silence that once filled the mansion. This one had memory in it, and accountability. "I read your letter," he finally said. Simple words, unarmored. Eleanor studied him quietly, not as a husband, not as a title, but as a man who had finally stepped out of the role he assumed would always hold her. "And," she asked, only one word, but it carried the weight of everything he had never answered. He did not try to defend himself. That was new. "I thought silence meant acceptance," he said at last. A pause. Then, more quietly, "I was wrong." The wind moved through the garden between them. No grand gesture answered him. No immediate forgiveness softened the space. But something subtle shifted anyway. Not reconciliation, not yet, but recognition that the story had not ended the moment she left the house. It had only stopped being one-sided. Eleanor looked toward the horizon where winter light touched the fields. Then back at him. "You never listened to silence," she said. A pause. "Only your interpretation of it." The Duke lowered his gaze. For once, he did not respond quickly, because there was nothing quick about undoing what had been misunderstood for too long. Behind them, the estate remained still. No candles to extinguish here. No chandeliers to dim. Only daylight, uncontrolled, unowned. And in that quiet space between them, something no longer performed its old role. Not obedience, not dominance, but possibility. The Duke finally stepped back slightly, as if acknowledging distance rather than trying to close it. "I do not expect you to return," he said. Then, after a breath, "I only wanted you to know. I see it now." Eleanor did not answer immediately, not because she had nothing to say, but because, for the first time, her silence was no longer survival. It was choice. And as winter light stretched across the land between them, the house he once ruled learned, somewhere far behind him, what it meant to exist, without her silence, holding it together. And the woman he had once mistaken for stillness stood now in something far more difficult to understand. Not absence, not presence, but power that no longer asked permission to exist.